The evening was quiet, almost too quiet. We'd just wrapped up our usual dinner date, and everything around us felt strangely still, like even the world was holding its breath. He had that look in his eyes, one I couldn't quite read, distant, almost haunted. I could feel a sense of dread starting to creep up my spine, settling in like an unwelcome guest. Finally, as we stepped out into the evening air, he stopped abruptly, glancing down at the ground before looking back up at me. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight I could feel in my bones. "I have something to tell you," he said, and those words alone hit me like a slap. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. Just stay calm, I thought. Maybe it's nothing. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my tone light, hoping he'd snap out of whatever mood he was in and realize how ridiculous he was being. But deep down, I knew something was coming, something that wouldn't leave us the same. He took a deep breath, eyes flickering away before finally meeting mine, and in that moment, I knew. I could see it written all over his face, the regret, the hesitation, the apology. He hadn't even spoken yet. "There's someone else," he said finally, his voice steady, deliberate, each word sinking into me like stones pulling me down. Someone from my past. My heart stopped. I felt like the world had been flipped upside down, like everything I knew was slipping away. "What do you mean?" I asked, almost laughing, as if this was some kind of twisted joke. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with an apology I didn't want. "She was my first love. From when we were kids," he said, barely meeting my eyes, as if he couldn't bear to look at the mess he was making of us. I thought those feelings were gone, buried with time. But they came back. The words washed over me, leaving me feeling empty, hollow. We'd been together for years. Years of memories, late-night talks, dreams and promises. And now here he was, telling me he was leaving me for a memory, for a girl who existed only in the past, in some idealized version of his life. He was throwing away everything we'd built for the fantasy of a childhood crush. "So, that's it?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky, sharp, laced with a bitterness I couldn't hide. "You're just going to walk away from everything we have, everything we built together, for someone who barely knows you anymore?" He winced at my words, but he didn't look away. "I can't explain it," he said softly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "But I have to follow my heart." His heart. The same heart that had once been mine. The heart we'd woven together with plans and dreams of a life we'd build together. He was tearing it apart, piece by piece, with every word he said, with every second he looked at me like I was already in the past. I could feel the anger, the hurt, bubbling up inside me, threatening to spill over. But I refused to let him see me break. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing just how much power he held over me. No, if he was going to walk away, I'd make sure he'd remember it. "Fine," I said, my voice cold, hollow, though inside I was burning, every part of me screaming in pain. "Go chase your childhood dream. But don't expect me to sit here waiting when it doesn't work out." Without another word, I turned and walked away. Each step harder than the last, my chest tight, my mind reeling. I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of his gaze as I went, but I didn't look back. Not once. If he could let go of us so easily, then I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. As I walked, I could feel the pain spreading, filling every corner of my mind, every part of my body. I couldn't shake his words, couldn't stop them from echoing over and over. Someone else. His first love. How long had he been holding on to this? How long had he been planning to leave, while I was here, thinking we were building a future? A part of me wanted to turn back, to scream, to ask him how he could just throw us away like this. But I kept walking, forcing myself to keep going, one step at a time, even as my heart broke with every step, and one thought echoed louder than the rest. If he could toss me aside so easily, maybe he never really loved me at all. The night air was cool, biting, but I barely felt it. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of everything we'd built, everything we'd shared, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I felt like I was leaving pieces of myself behind with every step, scattering them like breadcrumbs, a trail of memories I didn't want to follow. I don't know how long I walked, lost in a storm of hurt and anger and disbelief. The city lights blurred, the sounds around me faded into a distant hum, and all I could see was his face, the way he'd looked at me as he told me he was leaving. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, like everything I'd ever known was slipping through my fingers. Eventually, I found myself by the water, the dark surface stretching out in front of me, vast and empty, just like the way I felt inside. I sat down on a bench, the cold seeping through me, and for the first time, I let the tears come. Silent, bitter tears that fell like rain, each one carrying a piece of the life we'd built, a life he'd just thrown away. In that quiet, lonely moment, I made a promise to myself. I would survive this, I thought, gripping the edge of the bench until my knuckles turned white. I would get through this, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how many pieces of me he'd taken. And one day I would be stronger for it. But right then, all I could feel was the pain, raw and unyielding, like a wound that refused to heal. The city lights blurred, my mind spinning, and for a moment I felt like I was floating, untethered, lost. But even as the hurt and anger swirled inside me, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let him see me like this. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd broken me. With that thought, I stood up, wiping away the last of my tears. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I was going to pick up the pieces of myself he'd left scattered along the path we'd walked together. But I knew one thing. I would keep going. I would rebuild, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. Because if he couldn't see my worth, then I would make sure that one day, someone else would. The days that followed were a blur. I'd get up, go through the motions, but it was like I wasn't really there. Everything around me seemed to have lost its color, its life. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing out emails, but my mind would wander back to that night, replaying every word he'd said, every look he'd given, like I could somehow make sense of it if I just went over it enough times. I tried telling myself it was just a phase, that I'd get over him. But everywhere I turned, there he was. In the places we used to go, in the coffee shop where we'd sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Even the music on the radio was a minefield of memories, each song like a knife, cutting just a little bit deeper every time it played. Friends started checking on me. They'd drop by with sympathetic smiles, their voices soft, like they were afraid I'd shatter if they said the wrong thing. "You'll be okay," they'd say, their hands resting on my shoulder or squeezing my hand, like they could somehow transfer their strength to me. I'd force a smile, nod, tell them I was fine, that I was just tired or busy, or something, anything, to keep them from seeing just how hollow I felt inside. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock, that's when it would hit the hardest. I'd lie there, staring up at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind, every laugh we'd shared, every whispered promise. And it felt like he was right there, like I could reach out and touch him, only to remember that he was gone, that he'd left, and it was like losing him all over again. I'd close my eyes, trying to push him out, trying to find some peace, but he was there, in every corner of my mind, a ghost I couldn't shake. I'd see his face, hear his voice, that look in his eyes as he told me he was leaving, and it was like a knife twisting in my chest. And I'd lie there, choking on the silence, on the weight of everything he'd left behind, until sleep finally dragged me under. Every morning, I'd pull myself out of bed, plaster a smile on my face, and pretend I was fine. I didn't want anyone to see the cracks, didn't want anyone to know how close I was to falling apart, because if I let them see, if I let myself be vulnerable, it would make it all real. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I tried keeping myself busy, filling every moment with something. Work, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied, to keep the pain at bay. But it was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for the quiet moments, the stillness, when it could creep back in and remind me of everything I'd lost. And as the days bled into weeks, I started to feel the anger fading, slipping away like sand through my fingers, leaving only a dull, hollow ache. The bitterness that had kept me going, that had fueled my every step, was gone, leaving me feeling empty, like a shell of the person I used to be. I'd look in the mirror, and it was like I didn't even recognize myself anymore, like I was staring at a stranger. My friends would ask me how I was doing, their voices full of concern, but I'd just smile, nod, tell them I was fine. Because what else could I say? that I felt like I was disappearing, like I was losing myself piece by piece, that every day felt like a battle just to keep going, to keep moving forward, even though I didn't know where I was going anymore. They'd look at me with those sympathetic eyes, and I'd feel a flicker of anger, a spark of resentment, because they didn't understand. They couldn't. They hadn't been left behind, hadn't been told they weren't enough, that they'd never be enough. They hadn't had their entire world ripped out from under them, leaving them standing in the wreckage, trying to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer existed. And it was that anger, that bitterness, that kept me going. It was the only thing that made me feel alive, that reminded me I was still here, still fighting, even if I didn't know what I was fighting for anymore. It was a twisted kind of comfort, a dark, bitter warmth that I clung to, because without it, I had nothing. But even that started to fade, slipping away until all I was left with was the emptiness, the silence, the hollow ache that had taken up residence in my chest. I'd find myself sitting in the dark, staring at the walls, my mind blank, my heart numb. I didn't know how to move forward, didn't know how to let go, because letting go meant accepting that it was over, that he was gone, and I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I'd never be ready. And then one evening, when I thought I'd hit rock bottom, when I thought I couldn't sink any lower, came the call that would change everything. A number I didn't recognize flashed on my phone, and for a moment, I almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, but something, call it curiosity, call it fate, made me pick up. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from days of silence, of words left unspoken. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a stranger, but there was a kindness in their tone, a gentleness that put me at ease. Is this? They said, my name trailing off their lips like they were unsure, hesitant. Yes, I replied, my heart pounding, that old familiar dread crawling up my spine. This is she. There was a pause, a heavy silence that hung in the air, and I could feel something shifting, something important, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. And then the voice spoke again, softly, almost apologetically. I'm calling about an accident. The world felt like it had tilted, like reality was slipping away, leaving me grasping at something I couldn't hold on to. An accident. The words echoed in my mind, strange and unfamiliar, but carrying a weight that I could feel in my bones. The voice on the other end continued, gentle and calm, like they'd done this 100 times before. There's been an accident. I'm calling from the hospital. The hospital. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, as I tried to make sense of what they were saying. A dozen questions ran through my mind, colliding, overlapping, but I couldn't form any of them. Though, who was in the accident? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. They paused, and for a moment, I thought they might have made a mistake, that they'd called the wrong person. But then they spoke, and their words hit me like a punch to the gut. It's him, they said, his name slipping from their lips, carrying with it 1,000 memories, 1,000 moments. The man I'd loved, the man who'd left me, was lying in a hospital bed, and suddenly the world felt too big, too empty. They explained the details, their voice calm and steady, filling the silence as I stood there, my mind racing. He'd been driving, a late night, maybe distracted, maybe just lost like I'd been. A car had come out of nowhere, a flash of headlights, a collision that had sent him spinning, tumbling into the darkness. He's stable, they said, a reassurance that did nothing to calm the storm inside me. But there's been some memory loss. Memory loss. The words felt foreign, strange, like they belonged to someone else's story, not mine. My hand shook as I held the phone, my mind struggling to process what they were saying. He'd left me, walked away from our life together, and now he didn't remember. He didn't remember any of it. Me, us, the love we'd shared, the pain he'd caused, all of it, gone. The voice on the other end kept talking, filling in details, explaining the situation, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was him, lying in that hospital bed, his mind a blank slate, free of the memories that had haunted me every single day since he'd left. He was free of the pain, the regret, the choices he'd made, while I was still here, carrying the weight of it all alone. Do you want to come see him? They asked finally, their voice soft, careful, as if they knew what they were asking was too much. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The idea of seeing him again, of standing by his bed while he looked at me with blank, empty eyes, like I was a stranger. It was too much. I didn't know if I could handle it, didn't know if I could bear to see the man who'd broken my heart without a single memory of what he'd done, what we'd been. But even as I stood there, caught between the past and the present, a part of me knew I had to go. I had to see him, even if he didn't remember me, even if he looked at me like I was nothing. Because somehow, despite everything, I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. "I'll come," I said finally, the words falling from my lips like a promise. "I'll come." The drive to the hospital felt endless, each mile stretching out in front of me like an eternity. My mind raced, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, confusion, a strange, bitter relief. He'd left me, torn my heart to pieces. But now he was the one lost, adrift in a sea of forgotten memories. And I didn't know if I was supposed to feel pity or satisfaction or something else entirely. When I finally arrived, the hospital lights cast a cold, sterile glow over everything. A reminder that this was real, that I wasn't dreaming. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing, my heart pounding as I neared his room. I could see the nurses' station, the doctors passing by, but everything felt distant, like I was moving through water, the world muted and blurry. And then, there he was. He lay in the bed, his face pale, eyes closed, a bandage wrapped around his head. There was something fragile about him, something vulnerable that I hadn't seen before. The man I knew had always been strong, confident, so sure of himself. But lying there, he looked almost broken, like a piece of him had been lost somewhere in the darkness. I took a step closer, my heart in my throat, as I tried to make sense of the scene in front of me. He was right there, the man who'd been everything to me, the man who'd walked away, and yet it felt like he was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't know me. As I stood there, he opened his eyes, blinking against the light, his gaze unfocused, distant. And then his eyes met mine, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or confusion. But then it was gone, replaced by a blank, empty stare, like he was looking at someone he'd never seen before. Who are you?" he asked, his voice soft, hesitant, like he was afraid of the answer. The question cut through me like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. He didn't know me. He didn't remember me. The life we'd shared, the love, the pain, it was all gone, erased from his mind like it had never existed. I forced myself to smile, to keep my voice steady, even as I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I'm just someone who came to check on you," I said, the words feeling strange and foreign on my tongue. He nodded, his gaze drifting away, like he was already forgetting I was there. And in that moment, I felt a strange, aching emptiness, a hollow kind of pain that settled deep inside me. He was gone. The man I'd loved, the man who'd broken my heart, was gone, lost somewhere in the darkness of his own mind. I stood there watching him, feeling the weight of everything we'd been, everything we'd lost. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask him why, to make him remember. But I knew it was pointless. He didn't remember me. He didn't remember us. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was his freedom. As I left the room, I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders. He was free, free of the memories that had haunted me, free of the pain, the regret, the choices that had torn us apart, and maybe, just maybe, I could be free too. But as I walked down that empty hallway, the tears finally came, silent and unrelenting, each one carrying a piece of the life we'd shared, the love we'd lost. And in that moment, I knew that I'd never truly be free. Not as long as he was out there, living a life without me, a life without the memories that had once bound us together. And for the first time, I wondered if forgetting was a gift or a curse. I left the hospital feeling like a part of me had been erased, as if I'd walked out of that room as a different person. The drive home was a blur, the streetlights casting strange shadows through the windshield, their glow cold and distant. I couldn't shake his blank stare, the way he'd looked at me without a hint of recognition, like I was a stranger intruding on his life. The man who had once known me better than anyone in the world now looked at me as if I were no one. And somehow, that hurt more than the day he'd left. For the next few days, I wandered through my life, feeling like I was in a dream, like everything around me was muffled, distant. Friends called, checked in, but I could barely find the words to tell them what had happened. I'd pick up the phone, hear their voices on the other end, but all I could think about was him lying in that hospital bed, staring at me with empty eyes, a blank slate where our memories used to be. And then came the guilt, a twisted, bitter guilt that settled deep inside me, gnawing away at the edges of my mind. I hated that he'd left me, that he'd broken my heart without a second thought. But seeing him like that, fragile, lost, it made everything I'd felt seem small, insignificant. How could I hold on to my anger, my resentment, when he didn't even know what he'd done? How could I hate someone who didn't remember breaking me? I kept telling myself that this was a fresh start, a chance to let go, to finally move on. He was gone, in every sense of the word, and there was nothing holding me back anymore. But that emptiness he'd left behind seemed to grow with each passing day, filling every corner of my mind, every quiet moment, until I felt like I was drowning in it. One night, I found myself going through old photos, the ones we'd taken on lazy weekends, on trips, on those quiet nights when it was just the two of us. I looked at his face, his smile, the way he'd look at me like I was his whole world, and it felt like I was looking at a ghost. The person in those photos didn't exist anymore, replaced by a man who didn't even know my name. My fingers hovered over the delete button, my heart pounding as I stared at those memories, the life we'd shared. Part of me wanted to erase it all, to wipe him from my mind the way he'd been wiped from his own. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Those photos, those memories, they were all I had left of him, of the person I'd loved. And I wasn't ready to let them go. Days passed, and every now and then I'd think about him, wonder how he was doing, if he'd managed to piece his life back together, if he'd found a way to fill the empty spaces in his mind. I tried to push those thoughts away, tried to convince myself that I didn't care. But I'd catch myself staring at my phone, my finger hovering over his contact, fighting the urge to call, to see if he'd remember me, if there was some part of him that still knew who I was. And then, one afternoon, just as I was starting to think I could finally move on, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and my heart stopped. It was him. The message was simple, just a few words. "I think we need to talk." I stared at those words, my mind racing, 1,000 questions swirling inside me. Did he remember? Was he just curious, trying to piece together the fragments of his life? Or was this something else, something I couldn't even begin to understand? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him, my heart pounding as I typed out my response. I told myself it was closure, that this was the last piece I needed to finally let go. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see him. Needed to know if there was still something left of us, something that hadn't been lost in the darkness of his memory. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups blending into a soft, comforting background. I spotted him sitting by the window, staring out at the street, his expression thoughtful, distant. He looked the same, yet different. There was a weight in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment there was that same blankness, that same emptiness. But then a flicker of something, recognition, or maybe just curiosity crossed his face, and he offered me a tentative smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice soft, careful, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I nodded, sitting down across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "You wanted to talk?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table, his fingers tracing patterns on the surface. I don't remember much," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know we were something to each other." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and bittersweet. He didn't remember, not really, but there was a part of him that knew, that felt the weight of what we'd been, even if he couldn't recall the details. "Why did you want to meet?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment I saw the person he used to be, the man I'd loved, the man who'd broken my heart. "I don't know," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, aching honesty. I needed to see you. I needed to know." The pain, the confusion, the anger, all of it surged up inside me, a storm I'd been holding back for so long. "You left me," I said, my voice breaking, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "You chose someone else. You walked away from everything we had, everything we were, and now you don't even remember." He looked down, shame flickering across his face, a shadow of regret that he couldn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with a sincerity that hurt more than any lie he could have told. "I don't remember, but I'm sorry." The apology felt hollow, empty, a bandage on a wound that ran too deep. But there was something in his eyes, a softness, a vulnerability that made it impossible to hate him. He was just as lost as I was, trapped in a life he couldn't remember, haunted by memories he couldn't reach. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. And for the first time I felt a strange kind of peace, a quiet acceptance that I hadn't been able to find before. He didn't remember, and maybe he never would, but that didn't change the love we'd shared, the life we'd built. It was real, even if he couldn't see it anymore. As I got up to leave, he reached out, his hand resting on mine, a silent question in his eyes. "Will I ever remember?" he asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. I looked down at him, a sad smile tugging at my lips. "Maybe," I said, my voice gentle, understanding. "Or maybe, it's better if you don't." And with that, I walked away, leaving him there with his questions, his empty memories. For the first time, I felt free, the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a quiet, bittersweet peace. He might never remember me, but I would always remember him. The love we'd shared, the lessons he'd taught me, and that, I realized, was enough. Script Part 5, The Aftermath. I left the cafe feeling lighter. It wasn't the feeling I'd expected. I'd thought seeing him, hearing his apology, would stir up all the pain again, reopen the wounds I'd barely managed to close. But instead, there was a strange calm that had settled over me, a quiet acceptance that I hadn't felt before. As I walked home, the memories came flooding back. Moments of laughter, quiet nights, his hand in mine. And this time, instead of the usual sting, they felt gentle, soft, like pages from an old book I'd finally finished reading. There was a time when I thought those memories would haunt me forever, when I couldn't imagine a day where he wasn't a shadow lingering in the corners of my mind. But now they felt like something I could carry with me, not as a burden, but as a part of me. That night, lying in bed, I replayed our conversation in my mind, letting each word sink in. He didn't remember. He hadn't just forgotten me, he'd forgotten all the pain, the mistakes, the regrets, and somehow that made it easier for me to let go. He was starting over, and maybe I could too. Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. I threw myself into new routines, new hobbies, things I'd always wanted to try but had put off for one reason or another. I signed up for a pottery class, went hiking with friends, started writing again. Things that made me feel alive, things that reminded me of who I was before him. Friends started noticing the change, the way I'd laugh a little louder, smile a little brighter. They'd tell me how proud they were, how happy they were to see me coming back to life. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was faking it. The emptiness, the ache he'd left behind was starting to fade, replaced by a new sense of purpose, a feeling of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. One afternoon, I found myself walking through the park, the same one we used to visit together. I'd avoided it for so long, afraid of the memories it held, the ghosts that lingered there. But this time, it felt different. The trees, the benches, the paths we used to walk, all of it felt familiar, but in a comforting way, like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. As I sat on one of the benches watching the world go by, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, a kind of forgiveness I hadn't thought possible. I didn't hate him anymore, didn't feel the bitterness that had once consumed me. In some strange way, I was grateful for everything we'd been, for everything he'd taught me, even if it had come with heartbreak. Because without him, without that pain, I wouldn't have found the strength to become the person I was now. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting, replaced by something softer, lighter. And for the first time, I realized that I was ready to let go, to move on, to open my heart to new possibilities, new beginnings. The days rolled on, and with each one, I felt like I was finally finding my own rhythm, something that was mine, untouched by the past. I could feel myself coming back to life, piece by piece, like I'd been asleep for so long and was finally waking up. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I wasn't weighed down by the past, by what could have been. One evening, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I found a journal I'd kept back when we were together. It was filled with little notes, ideas, dreams I'd had, things I'd wanted to do but had tucked away, telling myself I'd get to them someday. I'd forgotten about so many of them. Small dreams that felt too fragile to share, plans I'd put on hold, waiting for the right time. But now, holding that journal, those dreams felt within reach again. I flipped through the pages, reading over the lists of places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to write, things I wanted to learn. I'd written about traveling, about exploring new cities and cultures, about learning new skills, pushing myself beyond the familiar. And as I read, I felt a spark of excitement, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in ages. The next day, I booked a solo trip to a small town along the coast, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting but had never made time for. It felt surreal. Standing at the ticket counter, planning something just for me, with no one else's needs or expectations weighing on my decisions. And as I boarded the train, watching the city fade away behind me, I felt a rush of freedom, a thrill that was all my own. The town was quiet, nestled by the ocean, with winding streets and old buildings, each one telling its own story. I spent my days wandering through art galleries, exploring hidden beaches, drinking coffee at little cafes that overlooked the water. I met people from all walks of life, artists, travelers, locals who had lived there their whole lives, and each one seemed to remind me of the beauty in starting fresh, in embracing the unknown. One afternoon, as I sat on the beach watching the waves, I thought about everything I'd been through, all the pain, the heartache, the nights spent wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. And in that moment, I realized something profound, something that filled me with a deep sense of peace. I'd survived. I'd weathered the storm, walked through the fire, and I was still here, stronger and more resilient than before. The ocean stretched out in front of me, vast and endless, and I felt that same vastness inside of me. A space for new memories, new dreams, new beginnings. I didn't need to fill it all at once. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep going, to trust that each step would lead me somewhere worth reaching. The trip came to an end, and as I boarded the train back to the city, I felt like I was returning as a different person. I had a new sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need to hold on to a past that no longer served me. I was enough, just as I was. Back in the city, I threw myself into new projects, new goals. I started writing again, pouring my heart into words that felt like they'd been waiting for me all along. I signed up for a photography class, capturing moments of beauty in the everyday, finding joy in the simplest things. Each day felt like a new chapter, a new chance to grow, to learn, to become the person I'd always wanted to be. And as I walked through the familiar streets, past the places we used to go, I felt a quiet kind of gratitude. I didn't hate him anymore, didn't feel the sting of betrayal that had once haunted me. Instead, I felt thankful. Thankful for the lessons, for the strength I'd found in myself, for the journey that had led me here. I realized that he had given me something precious, something that had been there all along, but that I hadn't been able to see. He'd given me the chance to find myself, to stand on my own, to discover a strength that went beyond anyone else's love, anyone else's approval. And as the days turned into weeks, I felt that empty space inside me begin to fill, not with memories of the past, but with hope for the future. I was ready to move on, to open my heart to new possibilities, to let go of the fears that had held me back for so long. For the first time, I felt free. Free from the weight of the past, free to live my life on my own terms, free to embrace the unknown with open arms. Months passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt entirely my own. The scars were still there, faint reminders of everything I'd been through, but they no longer hurt the way they once did. They were part of me, part of the story that had shaped me into who I was. And I was proud of that person, proud of the strength I'd found in myself, the resilience that had carried me through. One evening, I found myself at a small gathering with friends. Laughter filled the room, the warm glow of candlelight casting soft shadows on familiar faces. I looked around, realizing how much had changed, how far I'd come. For so long, I'd felt like an outsider in my own life, like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer fit. But now, Now I was present, fully here, fully alive. As the night wore on, I found myself talking to someone new, a friend of a friend, a stranger with a kind smile and easy laughter. We talked about books, about travel, about all the little things that make life beautiful. And for the first time, I felt a spark, a quiet excitement that I hadn't felt in ages. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something, a small flame that reminded me there was still so much left to discover, so much left to feel. After he left, I found myself smiling, a genuine, effortless smile that felt like a gift. I didn't know where life would lead me, didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to embrace whatever came my way, to open my heart to new possibilities, new beginnings. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about him. The man who had been such a huge part of my life, the one I'd thought I'd never be able to let go. I thought about the love we'd shared, the memories we'd made, and the pain that had followed. And for the first time, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet sense of gratitude. He had been a chapter in my life, a chapter that had taught me more about myself than I ever could have learned on my own. He'd shown me the depths of my strength, the resilience that lay buried beneath the pain. And in the end, he had given me the greatest gift of all, the chance to rebuild, to find myself, to discover a life that was wholly, beautifully mine. I didn't need to hold on to the past anymore, didn't need to cling to memories that no longer served me. I was free, free to live, to love, to create a future that was bright and full of hope. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. I was stronger, wiser, and more whole than I'd ever been. And as I closed my eyes, a peaceful smile on my face, I knew that the best was yet to come. The story reminds us that life's toughest heartbreaks often hold the seeds of our greatest growth. Sometimes, the things that feel like endings are actually new beginnings, opportunities to rediscover our strength, our worth, and our ability to find happiness on our own terms. True healing isn't about forgetting the past, but learning to carry it with grace, letting go of what no longer serves us, and making room for the future. Embracing change, accepting loss, and finding purpose within ourselves are what ultimately set us free. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that capture life's twists, challenges, and journeys to self-discovery. Share your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments below. Sometimes, sharing our stories helps others find their own path to healing. And remember, your journey might have its ups and downs, but it's all leading you to a future that's worth every step.